Hi, I'm Dr. Erin Keating, and this is sort of my channel where I post videos that I'm working on in terms of my own research, also sort of some things related to my teaching, sometimes in conversation with students when I can convince them to do that with me, and also on my own. And in this particular video, this is my second Malazan video for the channel, and I'm going to be looking at Gardens of the Moon in particular, and so this is a spoilers video for Gardens of the Moon, just so you're aware of that. Make sure that's right off the top. Um, and I'm going to be focusing today on Adjunct Lorn in this first book of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and I'm going to be using her character to explore the way that the novel plays with the Marxist concept of overdetermination. So I wanted to start by defining that key concept that's sort of guiding the video today, that of overdetermination. And I'm going to be drawing on the work of Althusser, Williams, and Stuart Hall to sort of explain that. And so this is a concept that comes out of Marxism and Marxist thought, and it's an attempt to resist an oversimplistic, abstract, deterministic link between the base and the superstructure of a society. So as a reminder, in Marxist thought, the base is the economic structures of society, and the superstructure is made up of the areas of society that are in some ways determined by that base. And of course, Marxists sort of argue about how that determination actually works. And the superstructures, so the political structures, the cultural, historical structures, the ideological structures of a given society. Um, and that's a simplistic version, but it's enough for the moment for these purposes. So many Marxists from the 1960s forward use overdetermination to resist a simplistically deterministic understanding of society and history, to emphasize that forces within the superstructure of society can exert deterministic pressures on societies as they move forward temporally, and can exert pressures even on the base. And so as Raymond Williams puts it in Marxism and Literature, I'm quoting here, the concept of overdetermination is an attempt to avoid the isolation of autonomous categories, but at the same time to emphasize relatively autonomous, yet of course, interactive practices. And as a reminder, all of the sources that I'm going to be quoting from or mentioning in the video can be found below in the video description. And so Raymond Williams also sort of further defines overdetermination in that same source, and he defines it as a recognition of multiple forces rather than the isolated forces of modes or techniques of production, and the further recognition of these forces as structured in particular historical situations rather than elements of an ideal totality, or worse, merely adjacent. This is a more sort of postmodern view of history in some ways, in that it rejects totalities and sort of overarching meta-narratives in favor of complexity and the recognition of multiple forces or causes or sort of narratives, right? Um, and of course, if you're interested in postmodernism, Andy Smith has a video quite from years ago now about postmodernism in relation to the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and Ruth and Bad has a response to that, considering the question from a more non-Western framework. And I'm going to link both of those videos here and below, just in case you haven't had the chance to watch them, although I'm sure many of you have, as they've been up for a little while now. And I want to note, in terms of this particular video, this dive into overdetermination is also very much coming out of a Western tradition of thought, although far more sort of explicitly Marxist than that other video. So back to overdetermination. Overdetermination is a concept that attempts to grasp the complexity of history thought of as material and real. And there's one of the places you might consider, of course, Marxism diverging somewhat from strands of postmodernism. So I'm not suggesting they're the same things. They're certainly not. And so Althusser sort of puts this way in his writings. Quote, this overdetermination is inevitable and thinkable as soon as the real existence of the forms of the superstructure has been recognized, right? So the material here, the real, is very important in terms of how we think about how overdetermination works and why it's such a necessary and important concept. So in Stuart Hall's essay on the discipline of cultural studies, he points to this Althusserian concept as important for Marxist cultural studies, mainly because of its focus on practices, right? So I'm just quoting from Hall here. Classes are not simple economic structures, but formations constituted by all the different practices, economic, political, ideological, and their effects on each other, right? So the important thing that you can sort of see in bringing together all three of these Marxist thinkers is that things like base, superstructure, ideology, hegemony, etc., are not abstract categories. We can't sort of just relate to them and think about them as abstract categories. They need to be seen as formative practices or processes that exert significant pressures on each other and on the individuals within them. And Williams goes so far as to suggest that elements of culture are not necessarily confined to the superstructure, but rather can actually act as a part of the base of a given society in their formative powers, right? So it's really complicating that traditional model of Marxism, although arguably this was also already in Marx, but that's, for another time. What's also important here, though, is that these forces are not necessarily, but can be related, right? So this is not an attempt to stitch a multiplicity into totality, but rather to recognize the complexity of social forces in the events of history and in the maintenance of hegemonic power. So Erikson's use of overdetermination, particularly in his representation of sort of the imperial hegemony, is what I'm really interested in thinking about when I'm talking about Lorn in this video. Briefly, what I mean by hegemony here follows from Gramsci's definition of hegemony, which sort of distinguishes it from rule. So it's not sort of the same as sort of an international politics idea of hegemony. And so as Raymond Williams glosses this, let's quote here, hegemony is a lived system of meanings and values. It thus constitutes a sense of reality for most people in the society, a sense of absolute because experienced reality beyond which it is very difficult for most members of the society to move in most areas of their lives. It is, that is to say, in the strongest sense, a culture, but a culture which has to be seen as the lived dominance and subordination of particular classes. And he, of course, links this to ideology as well in his work. And so I think this is helpful to think about in relation to Lorn and the Empire. Lorn is simultaneously a pawn and an agent of empire, right? It's not, a radical thing to say. So this is not a part of the novel that's subtle, it's not hidden, but that's intentional. So almost everything about Lorn is overdetermined in this novel in a way that highlights her lack of agency, and by the end, her individual insignificance when she's no longer of use to the empire. Or in a way to the narrative, right? And there's a meta way of thinking about this. So I'm going to be hinting at, but not necessarily diving into just, time. So early on, Lorna is shown as perhaps unconsciously struggling against the deterministic pressure the empire exerts to control her identity in addition to her actions. And so I want to give an example of this. One of the straightforward ways that the narrative is representing this is the frequent switching between the use of Lorn and adjunct within the narrative voice, even when it's being focalized through Lorn herself, demonstrating the way that she sort of internalized that role. And any sort of literary terms I'm using, I'm going to be throwing a definition up. Feel free to ignore it if you're well aware of them, but it's there for you if these are the first time you're hearing these things. So in chapter 9, if you'll remember, when Lorn and Talk the Younger are coming into the city of Pale, Lorn's thoughts are conveyed by the narrator in a way that moves between the two names or labels, and this passage covers a fair amount of paragraphs, so I will be skipping, pieces of it just to make the points succinctly rather than reading, 3 or 4 paragraphs. But this is within sort of a 2-page interval. So I quote here, Lorn leaned back in her saddle. The pain in her shoulder had become a steady throb, and she was glad the journey was done. Yet what troubled the adjunct the most was this vague tale of a hound of shadow doing battle with the second's last cadre mage. The adjunct was eager for her meeting with Taystrand. Talk the Younger snapped a salute, the energy behind it making Lorn wonder at his loyalty. So this is just one example, right? And I have actually wondered a little bit if there is a pattern to these shifts when they're happening in the narrative voice itself as opposed to an indirect speech. through which one could trace maybe a particular meaning as to when each label is used, something, something sort of meaningful in terms of Lorn's POV moments, but it's not really something I had time to pursue when thinking about this video, but I'm wondering if it might be fun to do if you're into that sort of thing. Um, but what we're seeing here, to move back to my point, is one of the most powerful hegemonic strategies of any society, right? The ability to inspire or force individuals to internalize elements of their own subjection as part of their core identities. And this is what Michel Foucault is called, I mean, in the translation, positive or formative power, which he actually argues is quite definitive of modern Western societies. Um, and so Erikson doesn't leave this subjectification process as an unconscious one in the book for either his character or the reader. And it becomes incredibly explicit in the dinner scene when Lorn meets Tattersall for the first time as an adult. So he's not just sort of having this under the radar in terms of her own understanding of herself. This is externalized in important ways. So the importance of this scene to revealing something sort of integral to the Malazan Empire is signaled in many ways. It could be considered almost sort of narratively overdetermined a little bit. It reminds the reader of the events of the prologue, which are seen from a distance at the beginning of the novel, but it's brought close through Lorn's memories as she describes the scene to Tattersall, right, in this later chapter. And so I do want to read from that scene just to sort of get us on the same page of what is happening in this moment. Talk saw Lorn trembling and held his breath. But when she spoke, it was controlled, the words precise. An explanation is required, she turned to High-Fist Dujek. They were recruits, a cadre of mages. They were in Malaz City, awaiting their new commander, when the Master of the Claw issued an edict against sorcery. They were sent into the old city, the Mouse, to cleanse it. They were, her voice caught, indiscriminate. She swung her attention back to Tattersall. This woman was one of those mages. Sorceress, that night was my last night with my family. I was given to the Claw the very next day. The news of my family's death was kept from me for years. Yet, her words fell to a whisper, I well remember that night, the blood, the screams. And so you have this sort of moment in the description, as you'll recall. Lorn is calling sort of after this for Tattersall to be tried, right, for her part in the events in the Mouse Quarter, but she's blocked by both Dujek and then Taishran, right, in pursuing this sort of very personally motivated act of justice, right, against Tattersall. And Taishran is acting in this moment sort of as a mouthpiece for the externalization of this particularly effective strategy of hegemony that is waged and used sort of by the Malazan Empire in the very sort of role of the adjunct to the emperor. And so I'm going to read for a minute what Taishran says, that sort of stops her in her tracks, if you will. Taishran spoke softly. The woman named Lorn, the woman who was once a child, who once had a family, he looked upon the adjunct with anguish in his eyes. That woman does not exist. She ceased to exist the day she became the adjunct. Lauren stared at the two men, her eyes wide. Standing beside her, Talk watched those words battering her will, crushing the anger, shattering into dust every last vestige of identity. And from her eyes rose the icy, clinical repose of the adjunct to the Empress. Talk felt his heart pounding hard against his chest. He'd just witnessed an execution. The woman named Lorn had risen from the turgid mists of the past, risen to right a wrong, to find justice, and in that last act reclaim its life, and she had been denied, not by the words of Dujek or Taishran, but by the thing known as the adjunct. So attributing it to that thing, the adjunct, is a bit misleading here, though. Like, the adjunct is a strategy, right? It's not just a fixed object or person. It's a strategy, a potent hegemonic strategy of the empire. And I don't mean like the empress here. This is a position that is beyond individual rulers and individual adjuncts. And though the adjunct is the most extreme example of this kind of complete internalization of one's place in the empire as one's identity, this strategy of power is seen throughout the novels, and in particular with regard to the political and military hierarchies that we see within the system. And I mean, an interesting contrast to this might be the ways that the figures in the deck of dragons work in terms of their relationship to their roles within the deck. Because I would say that's actually probably something quite different, but that would be sort of beyond the scope of this video. But it's an interesting contrast perhaps to think about. But to go back to Lorn, in this scene, Lorn is explicitly set up as metonymically representing the Empire, which impacts the way that we might interpret the scene of her death. And so that scene is where I sort of want to bring us next in terms of the novel. The ultimate insignificance of Lorn's death and the multiple threads that converge as separate causes of it also gestures to the difficulty and in many instances the futility of the Empire's attempts to maintain control over events that have been and continue to be informed by historical processes that the Empire neither sees nor can control. Thus, Lorn's death gives us one of the most striking, almost absurd moments of overdetermination in Gardens of the Moon. After she and Toole awake and raced, her final task left are sort of to hide the finished, which, as we know, has great import for the end of the book, but not one that Lorn foresees or does intentionally, right? So that's another important point to thinking outside of personal agency here and seeing overdetermination in the events of the novel. And of course, Lorn's other role here is to try to kill the coin bearer or Crocus. Um, and it's interesting that even as she's doing this, Erikson depicts Lorn as losing faith in her role and in the actions of the Empire. And so you have this moment, it's quite late in the novel, where she says, she realized with sudden comprehension that she was breaking down. The adjunct was cracking, its armor crumbling, and the luster gone from its marbled grandeur. A title as meaningless as the woman bearing it. And the narrator in that same sort of scene also uses this phrase, a roar of history without meaning, as Lauren's imagining what she expects will befall Darujhistan. And this is a statement on genre, both in terms of history and fantasy. And I'll be coming back to that sort of later in the video, but it also captures the notion of overdetermined history, which is rife with contradictions amongst the complexity of workings such that it resists a clear narrative, a clear singular meaning. So if we look at Lorn's death, it has three converging agents. You have the members of the Crimson Guard who are protecting Crocus, so it's Fingers, Cal, and Corporal Blues. You have Mies and Arilta who are working on behalf of the Eel, that slippery fellow, and Perrin who stands and then watches Lorn die. And so you have really, an enemy militia, Darujhistan's true protectors, and the rebels sort of within the empire separately coming together to destroy that empire's symbol of power. And so I want to remind us just in this moment what Williams says about overdetermination. So I'll sort of put up this quote again. A recognition of multiple forces rather than the isolated forces of mode or techniques of production, and the further recognition of these forces as structured in particular historical situations rather than elements of an ideal totality or worse, merely adjacent, right? So all of these are impactful, all of these sort of working together are necessary, but they do not create a totality. Right, so the scene gives the reader sort of a complex microcosm of the working of the history of empire. And what's explicitly important as well is that Lorn cannot, although she tries, she cannot create meaning out of her death, right? So as she's being attacked by Mies and Arilta, so this is sort of that middle part of this section, Lorn sort of reels in her lack of comprehension. She says, what a waste, she cursed. No, not like this. And even when they give her apparent answer, she's left confused. Who? She asked again. Who is this eel? Right? And when Perrin arrives and asks who's killed her, she again affirms her confusion, right? So notice the layering here. Notice how it keeps sort of being brought home, brought together, this sort of lack of meaning in how these seemingly disparate figures have come together in this moment, right? And so if we look at that quote, that conversation, if you will, very briefly between the adjunct and Perrin. He watched her eyes flicker open. She stared up at him. Recognition arrived. Captain. Ganos. Adjunct. They have killed me. Who? She managed a stained smile. I don't know. Two women. Looked like thieves. Thugs. Do you see the irony, Ganos Perrin? Thin-lipped, he nodded. No, glorious end for the adjunct. If you'd come a few minutes sooner. The captain said nothing. He watched the life leave Lorn, feeling nothing. So, in this moment of her death, Lorn is given no meaning, while the reader is given maybe too many meanings for, right, and causes of her death, but not the unified arc that some readers who've connected with Lorn as a character might want, right? So, what we're getting here is there each of the people involved in this scene, each of the groups involved in this scenes and the scenes that led up to it have a sort of meaning, a reason for Lorn's death. But none of those can be turned into a single overarching narrative, and none of those are given to Lorn to understand herself, right? So we see this sort of this overdetermination happening in this final moment. And Lorn and sort of the readers who may have sort of become attached to her might be searching for that clear narrative arc, right? That meaning for her character. But the emphasis is less on the death of Lorn and more on the many threads that he needed to act, not in a unified way, but in concert to attain that death. And if you'll remember, sort of mentioned earlier, because she has this metonymic relation to empire as the adjunct, this also gestures towards sort of the many different strands necessary to combat the power of the Malazan Empire in this book, and it's sort of broadly the power of empire, right? And so the ending of the novel, in terms of genre, I would say has quite a similar structure, but I want to return to that in a later video on Ganos Perrin and sort of his connections of the genre conventions of epic fantasy and how that is sort of works within overdetermination as well. So I'm going to wrap this one up here. Hopefully you've enjoyed this. Thank you very much for watching. If you found it interesting, please like, subscribe to the channel, comment below. I always want these videos to be an ongoing conversation, not just sort of like a lecture. And as always, I'm not saying this is the only way to interpret the text, right? The great thing about literary texts is that they always hold multiple interpretations. They hold and actually even demand multiple interpretations and meanings. And so I'm sort of offering this as one way that Erikson's novel can be understood and sort of thought about as in conversation with a very Marxist understanding of the processes of history and of the sort of the overdetermination and how it sort of acts in those processes as they relate to history, as they relate to the sort of movement, both temporally and sort of power-wise of empires.